Back in 1346, there was a disease known as the Black Death. The Black Death spread across Europe in many towns. Its origin came from the black rat, or also called the ship rat. If a person was infected by the plague, their body would swell in the groin, on the thigh, the armpit, and the neck. It would only take on average 23 days before a person dies from the plague. As it swept across the country, infecting and killing millions, it had a very heavy mental effect on those who were surrounded by the suffering. The people's reaction to this time of great sorrow can be studied today for how we should react if such a thing were to occur again. Death went from one end of the earth to the other. When the plague would reach a new town or city, the people would suffer from the plague until everyone died or moved on. The Pope at Avignon locked himself in a room, allowing no one to approach him. The wise teachers and physicians of the time could only say that it was God's will that started this plague, and that they were being punished. The plague also came to Strasbourg in the summer, and it is estimated that about 16,000 people died by the hands of the Black Death.
The actual cause of the plague was unknown to those living through it. They lacked the technology or the knowledge to correctly make a theory, and as a result was guided to the theory of God being the main abuser. Not because their faith had subsided, but rather because the extent of the plague was so wide and so dangerous, surely only God could be the culprit, as quoted from History of the Wars. But for this calamity it is quite impossible either to express in words or to conceive in thought any explanation, except indeed to refer it to God. It's a pretty sad conclusion to come to. Later, in History of the Wars, the extent of the people suffering by the plague and those taking care of the suffering was explained. It spoke of people overcome by delirium and insomnia fleeing away from their homes, screaming at the top of their lungs because they thought that they were being chased. Because of these people's sorry states, ones not suffering the same fate would more than often feel pity. The people taking care of those suffering would also endure a large amount of exhaustion. The work was so exhausting, in fact, that they got just as much pity as those suffering. To quote, "And those who were attending them were in a state of constant exhaustion and had a most difficult time of it throughout. For this reason, everybody pitied them no less than the sufferers." The work included things like feeding the infected, for it was hard to intake food on their own, putting the infected back on their beds if they fell off due to their constant writhing in agony, and the chance that the infected would attempt to jump in any pool of water they could find. Not for the sake of drinking, because they often ran towards the ocean, but rather because of their mental state. This work, too troublesome for most, would often be neglected, and thus the infected would suffer and die, sometimes by falling from a high place or simply dying of hunger. The risk in helping the infected also probably played a part in the neglect. As for how people communicated during a time of quarantine, it differed heavily between the people. Unsurprisingly, there were a lot of people who took to secluding themselves from the outside world and anyone else, eating and drinking little, talking to no outsiders, and refusing any news of the dead. They would keep themselves occupied by music or anything else pleasant. Others, though, took about it differently. They believed that, as quoted from the Decameron, drinking beer, enjoying oneself, and going around singing and ruckus raising and satisfying all one's appetites whenever possible and laughing at the whole bloody thing was the best medicine. They went from tavern to tavern every day and every night, drinking as much as they saw fit, only speaking of positive things. They would even often go from house to house. Parties like these were common because everyone was acting as if they were going to die soon, and in a way, they were correct. A result of this was how they lost any sentiment to their belongings or themselves, and thus, many houses became common property, allowing anyone to walk in and act as if it was their own. There was one more group of people, however, who lived in the middle ground between the first two. They did not restrict their access to food, nor did they indulge in it as much as they wanted. They rather only had it when they needed it. They didn't dissolve themselves like the second group through parties, but lived their lives as they usually would. They didn't lock themselves inside, but instead freely walked outside, holding a posy of flowers in their hand, occasionally smelling them to soothe their mind from the stench. There was also people who opted to run from it all to the countryside. This quote from the Decameron sums up the thought of those people pretty well. Huge numbers of men and women abandoned their rightful city, their rightful homes, their relatives and their parents and their things, and sought out to the countryside, as if the wrath of God would punish the iniquities of men with this plague based on where they happened to be, as if the wrath of God was aroused against only those who unfortunately found themselves within the city walls, or as if the whole of the population of the city would be exterminated in its final hour. No matter which type of person you were, however, didn't determine if you lived, but many people did fall ill, and in the case of falling ill, it was rare you'd have much help. When you fell ill, being abandoned was common, and as a result, many people would die each day. Thus, customs arose to deal with the dead bodies. The custom followed for a loved one's death that is still used today was thrown away for a new one. For those of the upper class, it changed in the way that instead of a mourn of the recently deceased, parties would be raised where people would drink away their sorrows. It also became rare for someone to be carried to the church of their choice, but rather the one closest. Those located in the middle class had it different, however. They would usually die alone with no one around them to care for them, such as the servants of the upper class. Their death would be realized by their neighbors before anyone else because of the smell. Those neighbors would gather the corpse and leave it outside on the street, where it would be gathered by funeral biers or by some other means. Streets would constantly be littered with corpses. So many people were dying, in fact, that everyone became desensitized to death. This is explained well in this quote from the Decameron. Things had reached such a point that people cared no more for the death of other people than they did for the death of a goat. For this thing, death, which even the wise never accept with patience, even though it occurred rarely and relatively unobtrusively, had appeared manifestly to even the smallest intellects. But the catastrophe was so unimaginably great that nobody really cared. The absolute massive amount of bodies coming into churches ultimately led to everyone running out of sacred burial grounds. So thus, many new spots to bury bodies were dug and everyone was thrown in haphazardly. Neglection of customs was common.
Death from disease was a constant fear of the people living in the Middle Ages. In the early part of the 14th century, there were outbreaks of typhoid fever, dysentery, and diphtheria. In 1316, about 10% of the population died from these three diseases. These deaths often reflected social conditions, especially poor sanitation, which became an increasing problem with the growth of towns. There was a new disease that the people had no immunity to. It has been described as the worst disaster in the history of the world. The disease, which was later known as the Black Death, first broke out in Mongolia. Then it was carried to the less mobile societies in China, India, and the Middle East. A ship returning from China sailed into Messina harbor. Most of the ship's crew were dead, and the survivors talked about a mysterious disease that killed off half their crew. The harbor master ordered the men to quarantine. The men died over the next couple of days. The disease quickly spread across Europe and reached England. The part of Bristol, England's second largest town, was hit very badly by the plague. Approximately 40% of the town's population died. The Black Death started to move east, and by the end of September, it was in London. When the plague would infect someone, their symptoms would be high temperature, tiredness, shivering, and pains all over the body. The next stage of symptoms were small red boils on the neck, armpit, or groin. These lumps were boo-boos. The next final stage of the Black Death was the appearance of small red spots on the stomach and over parts of the body. These red spots were caused by internal bleeding, and death followed soon after the third stage. When the Black Death hit an area, there was a strong temptation for people to flee their town or village as quickly as possible. This created hostility from people living in the other villages or towns. The people feared that the new arrivals would bring the disease with them. Many villages and towns became deserted. Sheep and cattle would wander fields and eat the crops that the people have planted. When a person would get infected with the plague, they had a 60% chance of dying within 2 to 5 days. Doctors could do very little to nothing at all when it comes to helping those who were suffering. The most common treatment doctors did was bleeding and washing the bodies of the sick in vinegar. Many people tried different options to heal the sick. Some believed that God was all-powerful, and they assumed that praying for the sick would help them. It was believed that one way of avoiding the plague was to punish yourself for your sins before you caught the Black Death. Some people took part in these flagellant processions. This involved people whipping each other in public. Up to 500 people would march into town where they would start beating their own backs with iron spikes until they were covered with bleeding wounds. Many historians have found it difficult to calculate the number of people who have died during the Black Death because of the lack of documentary sources.
The Jews, under suspicion of poisoning the wells and causing the plague, were also massively persecuted and burned at the stake.